A 737 crashes into a small turboprop sitting on a runway, completely mangling it.
It was as if we were in the middle of a big fireball.
2 months after 9/11, an Airbus 300 crashes, its tail mysteriously breaking off.
How much blood has to be spilled before we take corrective action? Safety does have a price.
An L-1011 jumbo jet unexpectedly loses altitude and plunges into the Everglades. What triggers the disaster?
Every bit of my clothing was blown right off.
Just miles from a runway, a jet runs out of fuel and slams into a hillside.
It doesn't take an aeronautics expert to know that if your engines go off, it's difficult to fly.
And a routine Continental commuter flight suddenly pitches and nosedives into a crowded Buffalo suburb.
They dropped the ball.
Mistakes, oversights, distractions, and in some cases just poor judgment. All these crashes are caused by human error.
The devastation to the entire operation is catastrophic. It's one of your own has potentially made an error that has resulted in this calamity, this tragedy.
There are many reasons why planes crash: poor weather conditions, mechanical difficulties, and structural failures. But according to a study published by the FAA, more often than not, the cause is just plain human error.
Human error shows up in about 80% of aviation accidents. If you find something that's mechanical in an airplane, you can change it. Changing how humans think or how they react under a given set of circumstances is much, much more difficult.
In this hour, dramatic animations will put you where no camera has ever been, up close to show how and why these disasters occurred. It appears to be a normal landing as U.S. Air Flight 1493 lowers its main landing gears onto the runway at Los Angeles International Airport. And then, in a flash,
that's a hill.
The 737 smashes onto a commuter turboprop that is sitting on the same runway, crushing the smaller plane completely.
The window next to me started melting.
In the early evening of February 1st, 1991, SkyWest Flight 5569, a turboprop carrying 10 passengers and 2 crew members, taxis toward an intersection of runway 24 left.
Intersection departures, with particularly for a turboprop, was a means to make their flight more effective, and they could get off the ground faster.
At 6:04 p.m., an air traffic controller clears SkyWest onto the runway, but advises the plane to hold its position.
And at that point is where one of the big causes of this accident sequence occur. She does not immediately clear them for takeoff. There's a delay. Every second that goes by, there's a mounting threat.
That's because minutes earlier, U.S. Air Flight 1493, a 737 that began its journey in Syracuse, New York, had been cleared to land on that same runway.
All they see is the menagerie of lights. It looks, in their mental picture, it looks like a normal landing runway. And as they're flying closer and closer, they still can't discern airplane lights from runway lights. They're all the same color.
The Boeing 737's main landing gears touch down. Then, as the nose lowers, the landing lights reveal the turboprop. That's the first time the captain sees the plane.
That's a hill.
There's an explosion on impact, and the small plane bursts into flames. But the 737 can't stop. At 70 miles per hour, it skids and finally crashes into an abandoned firehouse.
The floor was heaving, and the smoke burst right in front of my jump seat.
It was as if we were in the middle of a big fireball. Every passenger window was illuminated orange.
But I can see every passenger that can possibly have a view of me staring at me, looking for an answer.
Flight attendants began shouting orders to evacuate, but because of the raging fire, none of the left exit doors can be used. The front right exit door is damaged and won't stay open. Only a few are able to escape from there.
We jumped off the aircraft. I pushed the first person off the aircraft because I figure it's either you break your leg or you will not see your legs.
The right wing exit becomes blocked, leaving only one more exit for passengers to escape, the right rear exit. In all, 67 of the 89 passengers and crew make it out alive. But not everyone makes it through the exit doors.
We took a position on the nose of the airplane, and we happened to see that the co-pilot of the plane was trying to get out of the window. I took the ladder, small 12-foot ladder, and put it up to the nose of the airplane. And I was able to take a few steps up and help the co-pilot out, pull him out, and cradle him like a baby, bring him down, and then walk him with another fireman to safety.
The captain and the senior flight attendant are among the victims.
I remember feeling just a lot of sorrow. That two of my crew members died, that so many passengers died.
With the focus on the 737, few even know there's a crushed turboprop underneath it. The small plane is twisted and mangled beyond recognition. There are no survivors.
I did not know that we hit another aircraft until we were in the terminal, and they were doing triage on us. And I asked about the crew, and they said, "Which crew?"
Investigators immediately began the grim task of finding out what went wrong. John Cox, who is now an MSNBC aviation analyst, was an investigator for the Airline Pilots Association at the time.
As an aircraft accident investigator, it's one of the tougher ones that I have worked because there were still, some of the bodies were still in there. These things are always catastrophic to work. But it is absolutely vital that a group of people do this job so that we understand what happened and don't have a reoccurrence.
While poor visibility from the tower to the runway and glare shining into the tower are part of the problem, investigators focus on air traffic control.
Air traffic controllers, as a matter of routine, multitask.
929, take Victor, right turn 31 right and hold short of Whiskey.
They're issuing landing clearances, takeoff clearances, so the multitasking on that evening would not have been unusual. It is very unusual for a controller not to remember that they have an airplane in position on a runway.
But according to the NTSB, that is exactly what happened. It turns out that the local controller simply forgot that SkyWest was sitting on the runway intersection.
There were some things that were going on that did get her distracted. 1493 checked in. She looked. The runway end was clear, and it was just a human error. I wouldn't expect that anyone on the SkyWest to have ever understood what happened. It was instantaneous.
When U.S. Air Flight 1493 crashes into SkyWest Flight 5569, the aftermath is horrific. 22 people on the U.S. Air flight, including the captain, are killed. All 10 passengers and 2 crew members in the small SkyWest plane also die.
I wouldn't expect that anyone on the SkyWest to have ever understood what happened. It was instantaneous.
At the NTSB hearings, the air traffic controller, Robin Washer, testifies that she initially thought it was an act of terrorism.
U.S. Air 1493 came over the threshold normally. When the aircraft blew up, I assumed that the aircraft had a bomb on board, then it blew up.
Then Washer remembers another plane was on the runway.
I went to the ground control and I said, see if you're in contact with SkyWest 569. I went to the supervisor and I told her, I said, this is what I believe U.S. Air did.
She has a responsibility to ensure its safety from other traffic. That didn't happen.
The sound was almost overwhelming.
David Kelly, the surviving first officer, testifies that he and the captain were never made aware of another plane on the runway.
As far as we could tell, there was nothing down the runway anywhere. That airplane all of a sudden showed up out of nowhere.
The cabin lights went out, the emergency lights came on.
For Flight Attendant Bill Ibarra, who was critically injured, the hearing is an emotional experience.
I was filled with gratitude when passengers who survived came over and thanked me for my actions.
As a consequence of the collision, intersection departures at night are no longer permitted. And while on the runway, pilots are encouraged, though not required, to remind air traffic control that they are waiting for instructions.
These types of procedures were completely capable of being done before the accident. This was a totally preventable accident.
Across the country, and nearly 2 decades later, another crash caused by human error. Continental Connection Flight 3407 nears the Buffalo Airport for landing. The turboprop suddenly pitches up, stalls, and goes into a series of terrifying rolls. The pilot fights to gain control, but the plane plummets 1,600 feet into a house.
This aircraft was 5 miles out, and all of a sudden we have no response to that aircraft.
February 12, 2009. Winter storms delay Flight 3407 for 2 hours at Newark International Airport in New Jersey. Once it departs, the flight takes only an hour to Buffalo. But 3 miles from the runway, the captain runs into problems.
The speed was a little higher than he anticipated, and he made an adjustment. And what he did was he reduced the power, and they also extended the landing gear, which adds a lot of drag, and the speed decreased fairly rapidly to the point that a warning device in the airplane activated.
The warning system seems to take the captain by surprise, but it should be a fairly simple correction to get the plane's speed back up.
Instead of letting the airplane's nose drop to build up that airspeed, he gave it full power and lifted the nose up. He should have done the exact opposite thing.
Planes generally fly at a slight nose-up angle. This makes air move faster over the top of the wing than the bottom. This creates the important difference in pressure needed for lift, which allows planes to fly. But with too much pitch, the air pushes against the wing, not flowing across it, causing the plane to stall.
And when it stalled, the airplane became unstable. It rolled off to one side, then another. He continued to have the nose up.
The plane's stall protection system tries to take over by lowering the nose to gain airspeed. But the captain repeatedly pulls the nose back up, essentially putting the plane back into a stall. After 3 stalls, recovery is impossible. The plane crashes in the town of Clarence Center, 5 miles northeast of the Buffalo Airport. Everyone on board is killed, as well as 1 man on the ground. One of the victims is the daughter of former Continental pilot Mike Loftus.
Mallow was going up to a reunion game. Basically, it was a alumni game at Buffalo State College for the women's program. I think I turned the TV on that night to watch it for a brief moment, and that was when I had all those flames, and I turned the TV off.
One question investigators have is why the captain responded incorrectly when the plane stalled. According to the NTSB, part of the problem may have been the pilot's basic skills. The report states Captain Marvin Renslow never revealed to Colgan, the regional carrier for Flight 3407, that he had failed several certification exams.
He apparently wasn't completely honest in reporting those. But while he was at Colgan, he had also not passed some of the tests and the check rides that he had had.
Captain Renslow eventually passes all the required tests. Colgan points out that their crew training meets or exceeds requirements of the FAA. But former Inspector General of the Department of Transportation, Mary Schiavo, points to what she sees as a problem with the regional airlines in general: cost-cutting.
Their whole business model, is to fly inexpensive aircraft and save a lot of money because they have a fixed price contract. So if they can fly cheap planes cheaply, they make money under their contract. If they have more expensive pilots and more expensive planes, they don't.
The Regional Airlines Association disputes that and told NBC News their focus is on safety, professionalism, and reliability of service. Still, there are differences within the industry on how much flying time is required to pilot a commercial airplane.
You can be done with those ratings in as little as 350 hours of experience. And what happens is when people get out of flight school and they have their required government ratings, they then move on to the regionals because that's who hires them.
While major airlines usually pay better, they also demand that new hires have 1,500 flight hours or more. Further blame could lie with how Colgan trained its pilots on the Q400 stall protection system. Although it satisfied FAA standards, some of the training was done solely in a classroom setting, not hands-on.
15 minutes, that's all they're asking out of a training program, and they didn't even do that.
When Continental Connection Flight 3407, operated by Colgan Air, crashes into a Buffalo suburb on a wintry February night in 2009, there are no survivors. The tragedy raises many questions.
The airspeed decreased, and after further pitch and roll excursions, the airplane pitched down and entered a steep descent from which it did not recover.
One question investigators have is why the captain responded incorrectly when the plane stalled. According to the NTSB, part of the problem may have been the pilot's basic skills. The NTSB report also focuses on crew fatigue. Both the captain and co-pilot spent the night not in a hotel or their own beds, but instead in a crew lounge, against Colgan policy. And once behind the controls, they violated the sterile cockpit rule, which may have been the cause of their distraction.
During takeoffs and approach to landings, the pilot and the co-pilot, the entire crew, can talk about nothing but the flight at hand.
The idle conversation that was going on seems to have distracted them long enough for the aircraft to get to that point where it was a jarring moment that caused them to react.
The crash sparks enough debate that in the summer of 2010, the president signs a bill passed by Congress requiring commercial pilots have a minimum of 1,500 hours of flying time.
But even beyond that, there are a score of other safety provisions. They would require the FAA to get much more tough on pilot fatigue. They would require that the airlines disclose who's actually operating their flights so that no longer could people buy a ticket on Colgan without knowing it. So this legislation is very significant.
The companies let them down a lot. They didn't give them the tools they needed, I think, is really what it came down to. You got two relatively inexperienced pilots. It's the fact of life.
8 years earlier, there was another air disaster over New York, also caused by human error. An Airbus A300 takes off from JFK Airport to Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. Soon after takeoff, the plane encounters severe turbulence. It rolls, pitches, and then suddenly the tail snaps off. The plane nosedives into a residential area in Queens, New York.
All the people that were on that airplane went for a very harrowing ride in the last minute of flight going into the ground.
All 260 people on board are killed, as well as 5 people on the ground, leaving investigators wondering how and why the tail would snap off an airplane. November 12th, 2001. It is a bright, sunny fall morning as American Airlines Flight 587 climbs into the sky. In the cockpit are two experienced pilots, co-pilot Stan Mullen and Captain Ed States.
He loved to get in the airplane. He loved to be in charge. He respected everybody's job, everybody's role.
The co-pilot is flying the plane that is about 5 miles behind a 747 on its way to Japan.
Air 587 Heavy, 1,300 feet. We're climbing to 5,000.
Since the Airbus is climbing faster than the plane in front of it, Flight 587 quickly flies into the 747's wake, causing the American Airlines plane to experience turbulence. This in itself is not uncommon.
Airplane wakes are very similar to the wakes made by boats or ships. It's a displacement as the vehicle passes through this fluid, in one case water, in one case air.
This FAA simulation illustrates a different jet flying into wake turbulence. The wingtips from the lead plane create what is known as a wake vortex.
You can think of it as a very large cone coming back off the tip of the leading airplane. And if the trailing airplane intercepts that cone, you'll feel choppiness. Typically, the encounters are very brief, but you can hit them multiple times.
And that is exactly what happens with Flight 587. An Airbus A300 takes off from JFK Airport to Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. Soon after takeoff, the plane encounters severe turbulence. It rolls, pitches, and then suddenly the tail snaps off. The plane nosedives into a residential area in Queens, New York. All 260 people on board are killed, as well as 5 people on the ground, leaving investigators wondering how and why the tail would snap off an airplane. The co-pilot is flying the plane that is about 5 miles behind a 747 on its way to Japan. Since the Airbus is climbing faster than the plane in front of it, Flight 587 quickly flies into the 747's wake, causing the American Airlines plane to experience turbulence. This FAA simulation illustrates a different jet flying into wake turbulence. The wingtips from the lead plane create what is known as a wake vortex. There are 2 wake encounters. Although invisible to the eye, they are displayed here in our animation. The first wake causes the plane to roll to the left, and the co-pilot quickly puts it back on course. But then, 15 seconds later, the plane is caught in a second wake.
When this pilot got into the wake turbulence, the airplane started to roll. He put in flight control corrections that he thought was necessary to get the airplane back to a wings level state.
But instead of leveling out, the plane moves violently on all 3 axes of flight. Left and right rolls, side-to-side motion, and up and down. Then, the unthinkable happens. The tail snaps off. The plane banks left and plummets into a residential neighborhood in Bell Harbor, Queens. Just 2 minutes and 24 seconds after a routine takeoff, everyone on Flight 587 is gone.
Go ahead. Yeah, just to let you know, we saw a huge, tremendous amount of black smoke south of Long Island.
Captain Ed States' wife, Mary, is home when she finds out about a crash in Long Island and contacts American Airlines.
I got one of the chief pilots in New York. And it wasn't wasn't the ideal way of telling me, but I said, was Ed the pilot? And they said yes.
A devastating loss of life, a horrible scene in a residential neighborhood.
It looks like a war zone. If you've seen anything on television, it's just terrible.
Just 2 months after 9/11, people are wondering, could this be another terrorist attack?
Everyone should remain calm. We talked to the White House several times. There's air cover.
In this anxious climate, the NTSB works to find the reason the tail of the plane broke off. The scars from 9/11 are still very raw.
The industry was recovering. Traffic was down. People were apprehensive. It was a period of time that, after 40 years of being in the industry, I've never seen before or since.
I see the plane. The engine fall down.
2 months after the attack, another plane is down. And at first, an act of terrorism is feared.
We've preliminarily put the city on high alert, so we've closed certain things down just to make sure that we find out what this is all about.
Former Inspector General of the Department of Transportation, Mary Schiavo, followed the investigation.
That was everybody's first thought, but there were a number of clues, and they came out really quickly that it wasn't, because you had the cockpit voice recording. And then when they found part of the plane was detached from the plane itself, I mean, you knew right away, because pieces of the plane just are not ever supposed to fall off.
Once terrorism is eliminated as the cause, investigators focus on why the tail broke off. It takes more than 2 years before the NTSB findings are released. According to the report, the cause of the crash is the separation of the tail or vertical stabilizer due to the first officer's excessive use of the rudder pedal.
The entire vertical fin, which is the vertical stabilizer as well as the rudder, separated from the fuselage, and the airplane at that time became no longer controllable.
Normally, pilots only use controls called ailerons and flight spoilers to roll the airplane to wings level. These are panels located on the wing. The co-pilot does this, but he also uses the rudder. This is the panel attached to the vertical stabilizer, or the tail. It moves the plane from side to side. The rudder is operated by moving 2 foot pedals on the floor of the flight deck, forward or back.
It was his reaction and the overuse of the rudder during this encounter that generated forces that were large enough to actually snap the fin, the vertical fin, off.
MSNBC aviation analyst John Cox is satisfied with the findings, but the report is controversial. Aviation safety consultant Greg Feith believes a closer examination is necessary.
It's easy to say that the pilot put too much. The question is why, and that question to this day still hasn't been answered. The NTSB in its public hearing actually identified 11 events that had taken place involving these high loads where the vertical stabilizers fortunately did not separate. So now you have a trend here, you have a history, you have a historical record. But what I see in their investigation was they looked at all of these things in isolation rather than trying to find not only why the loads occurred, but how they occurred.
And Mary Schiavo believes there is another issue.
In their accident investigation, they have to rely on the manufacturers. And therein lies the problem. They had to go back to Airbus and say, hey, Airbus, what happened to your plane? And Airbus said, well, it was the pilot. The pilot used the rudder too aggressively. Why would you ever construct a plane and ever have the control system in the plane such that if it's used in a way in which it's allowed to be used, your tail would come off? It is unthinkable.
Airbus told NBC News that it was not a design flaw that caused the tail to break off. It was pilot error. The NTSB, in fact, did determine that. It also found that the American Airlines training program overemphasized the use of the rudder pedal inputs. Going a step further, John Cox says the rudder should never be used in wake turbulence.
The best response would have been to let the airplane's natural stability work through it. The airplanes are naturally very stable, and so put some control input in to bring the airplanes back toward wings level and let it fly out, and it'll settle right down.
American Airlines told NBC News that it continues to be disappointed with the NTSB findings and believes that the design and rudder sensitivity were at fault. A decade after the crash, the report stands as written. But in August 2010, the NTSB started re-examining similar incidents and urged agencies to take a closer look at the rudder design.
Pilots now understand you don't have to move the rudder that much as far as the pedals are concerned to create a large aerodynamic force. It's a powerful tool in helping the pilot in roll control. So be sensitive to the fact that, hey, if you're going to move this, you better use it as a last resort.
But this knowledge came at a very steep cost.
There is this adage out there in the aviation industry: how much blood has to be spilled before we take corrective action? Safety does have a price.
Coming up, without warning, a plane crashes into the Everglades.
The tail actually turned over, and when it did, the floor underneath me split and I dropped out.
A jet is flying over the Florida Everglades while the crew is trying to fix a problem with the nose gear. It shouldn't be a crisis situation, but it quickly becomes one. The L-1011 crashes into the swamp, killing more than 100 people.
What amazed me was they said that it was unsurvivable. How do you come out of that?
December 29th, 1972. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 is on the final leg of its flight from JFK to Miami International, carrying 163 passengers and a crew of 13. Ron and Lily Infantino were just married 20 days before and are now returning home from their honeymoon.
It was a perfect flight, smooth, calm air. It was just a very dark night.
The L-1011 is just 5 miles from the runway when the pilot extends the landing gears. Green lights indicate the main landing gears are down, but the nose gear indicator remains dark.
The nose gear showed that it wasn't either down or up. It didn't say what position it was actually in. So they broke the approach and advised air traffic control that they needed some time to sort through a technical problem.
Unaware of what's going on in the cockpit, Flight Attendant Beverly Raposa feels the plane turn away from the airport.
I wasn't concerned because, things like that happened, and if there was a problem, we had a phone by each of the flight attendant seats. If there was a major problem, the pilot would have called us.
To troubleshoot the problem, the L-1011 climbs to 2,000 feet and heads west towards the Everglades. The captain then puts the plane on autopilot.
Everybody wants to find the solution. That's just nature. We're human. We want to accomplish the mission.
The crew suspects nothing more than a faulty light bulb. The co-pilot starts to replace it, but he can't get the new bulb to go in.
And this is where the insidious nature of human error begins to show itself. Ideally, someone does nothing but monitor the autopilot. But with the difficulty that the first officer was having with the bulb, the captain, understandably, wanted to try to help him. No one was concentrating on monitoring the autopilot.
The crew is unaware that the airplane is slowly descending from 2,000 to 900 feet. Then from the control tower, they hear,
"How's it going out there, Eastern?" And the first officer looks up and realizes something's wrong with the altitude. And he said, "We're still at 2,000, right?" And the captain begins to look and says, "What happened to the altitude?" And they begin to take corrective action.
But it is too late.
The engines roared, and we hit, and the world exploded. It was a huge fireball.
The plane rips apart. The crash is scattered over an expansive area.
I was in the tail, and the tail section broke off. And we began spinning. And we spun 1,500 feet. And at the end of the spin, the tail actually turned over. And when it did, the floor underneath me split, and I dropped out.
In the swamp, Raposa is still strapped to her seat as jet fuel rains down on her. There is absolute silence.
Initially, I screamed, "Somebody help me." And I couldn't hear anyone. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my gosh, I may be the only survivor.
But she is not alone.
I have never been in anything so dark in my entire life. That's how dark it was. And I tell people, the only time you could tell somebody was in front of you, you could smell their breath. Otherwise, you would never know they're there.
Passenger Ron Infantino is also one of the 75 passengers and crew that miraculously survive. Swamp water is up to his chin.
Every bit of my clothing.
I was the primary pilot on the X-1, and my backup pilot was Lieutenant Bob Hoover. But the real brain in the team was Captain Jack Ridley.
Two members of the Bell Aircraft X-1 flight test crew joined the Army Air Force test team. They were Bell project engineer Dick Frost and crew chief Jack Russell. Yeager, Ridley, and Hoover were sent to Bell's facility at Buffalo to familiarize themselves with the X-1. But there was really only one person who had a body of experience flying the airplane. Yeager approached Slick Goodland for a test pilot's insight.
We had no one to talk to, and like I had a meeting with Slick Goodland and said, you know, what kind of technique you use for landing, what kind of speed you use for landing, and some of the pilot, talk. He was so ticked off that the Air Force had taken the program away from him. He said, well, if the Air Force wants to enter into a contract with me to check you out in the airplane, it'll cost a few $1,000. And as I recall, I looked down and said, I figure if you can fly it, I can fly it, and that was the end of that.
On August 6, 1947, Chuck Yeager was dropped in the X-1 for the first time. It was a glide flight.
It was easy for me to discipline myself into research flying, and I just had a little better, probably, hand-eye coordination. I had better visual acuity than most pilots. And the one thing that gave me a big advantage, more than anything else, was the ability to understand machinery. I was trained as a young boy to work on engines and mechanical things by my father. And then I was trained as a maintenance type in the Air Force before I became a pilot. The X-1 was a very complex piece of machinery, and it was easy for me to understand it. The ability to fly an airplane, is sort of secondary. Anybody's got that if they're trained for it.
Yeager made 2 more glide flights in the X-1 in the next 2 days. He'd already set tongues wagging when he rolled the X-1 just after launch on the first flight, and on the third, he performed a 2-turn spin. The X-1 test program shifted into a completely new gear. The Army Air Force was about to change. In July 1947, President Truman signed a document that would bring an independent United States Air Force into existence on September 18th. NACA appointed their own test pilots for the X-1. Their test program in the number 2 airplane, 6063, was also planned to start in September. The Air Force team concentrated on X-1 number 1.
I did all the flying on the number 1 airplane, 6062, because we were interested in high speed, and you didn't have the drag on the real thin wings that you had on the thick wing that was on the number 2 airplane.
The fastest the Bell pilots had flown the X-1 was 0.8 the speed of sound. The Air Force's plan, in consultation with NACA, was to make a series of flights that began where Bell had left off and approach Mach 1 in small increments of speed. Chuck Yeager painted a name on the side of the X-1. He called it Glamorous Glennis, after his wife. He was ready to fly under power.
It was my job to see the B-29 was operating normal, loaded, everything. But then I had to taxi it over to where they had dug a pit so the X-1 could fit down in the hole. And then they towed the B-29. I was in charge of that part until it came time to actually load the X-1 up into the B-29 and put it on the bomb racks. Then was a combination of Russell, the crew chief on the X-1, and my crew chief on the B-29, as well as Dick Frost. And of course, Chuck very interested in the whole thing too.
It's early morning at Muroc. The B-29 with 6062 slung tightly against its belly is taxied into position for fueling. 600 gallons of water alcohol mixture and liquid oxygen are pumped aboard the X-1. It's a volatile combination. The P-80 chase planes are prepared for flight. Their role is critical to mission safety. Bob Cardenas prepares for the takeoff.
My only problem I faced was on takeoff, I could not lift the nose wheel of the airplane more than about 11 inches off the ground without scraping the tail of the X-1. And of course, if you scrape the tail of the X-1 with the volatile fuel you had on board, there might be a problem.
The process of dropping the X-1 was not always straightforward.
When you use a plain B-5 bomb shackle, it's designed for 2,000-pound bomb and hang some 14,000 pounds on it, and you have to have a safety system where you have a pin in it to keep from releasing inadvertently. And the human element, a couple of times we released the X-1, pulled the release handle without pulling the safety pin out, and that bound it up. And all in all, it was an amusing thing every once in a while when you're sitting in the X-1. So it's, what in the Christ is going on up there,
If the X-1 wouldn't release, its fuel had to be jettisoned.
We dumped as much of the fuel as we could, that is the X-1, overboard, but I still had to land with it connected. Chuck stayed in it. He didn't trust anybody. He was going to make damn sure that if it did release inadvertently, at least he'd be in it to fly it away. Of course, when it got down to, I forget how high we were, but when it got down low enough where he figured he wouldn't have a chance to fly it anyway, he crawled back out, came up on board.
Chuck Yeager made his first powered flight on August 29, 1947.
Basically, the engine was really neat. And with rocket power, I'd never experienced it before. It's smooth, quiet, and when everything worked, it's beautiful. And same way with on the first powered flight, I took it up to about 0.85 Mach number, which is, 0.05 of a Mach number above what the Bell people had flown it.
Colonel Boyd wasn't impressed.
The airplane accelerated so fast, I went up to about 8.5 first. And when I came down and wrote up my report, he got a little stern with me. He said, why did you go above 8.2 Mach number? And I said, well, I was flying the airplane. It felt good. I saw nothing wrong with letting it accelerate out a little bit. But he said, just don't compromise safety. And that was one thing he was very stern about.
Speed was gradually increased over a series of flights.
We'd run it on out to 0.92 Mach number and got into buffeting. It was pretty heavy buffeting. And then at 0.94 Mach number, we're sitting there in pretty heavy buffeting. I rolled the airplane over and to pull 3 Gs at 9.4 Mach number, and we had no control of the airplane. The elevators were totally useless. And what we did then, we just rolled it out and turned off the rockets and came down and said, man, we got a real problem, because it had been predicted that the X-1 would either pitch up or down in the region of the speed of sound, and then we couldn't control it. If we couldn't control it in that region, we were in trouble.
The X-1's horizontal stabilizer assembly could be moved to adjust the trim of the airplane.
Now, we had never used this horizontal stabilizer in flight, because we just trimmed it out at 2 degrees nose down, left it there because that's where the airplane flew good. And that was where old Jack Ridley's brain came into effect. He said, after looking at a lot of the data, it showed that this shock wave, which had formed on the fixed part of the horizontal stabilizer, as we increased our Mach number, this shock wave moved back and sort of laying down. Well, at 9.4 Mach number, it was at the hinge point of the elevator, and we lost our elevator effectiveness. Well, Jack Ridley said, if let's try to fly the airplane with the horizontal stabilizer, and if you think you're good enough to do it, it may save your tail.
5 young kids out in the desert. We rolled it into the hangar. Jackie went down to Lancaster and got a worm gear, and we fixed the elevator neutral, modified the tail a little bit so that Chuck could actually work the whole tail, which later became known as the flying tail.
Then we went up and tried to fly the airplane with the horizontal stabilizer, and when we found out that we could, that solved all of our problems.
It was a tremendously important breakthrough, one that had a swift and profound effect on the design of high-performance aircraft, first in the United States and later around the world. As the X-1 project approached the speed of sound, there was discussion with NACA experts and academics about the hazard of exceeding Mach 1.
We had 4 PhDs descended on Muroc. Mr. Soule, Dr. Soule was one of them from Ames Laboratory. I believe Dr. Perkins from Princeton and Caltech and MIT. A real power. Well, Jackie Ridley took them on in the old tar paper operations shack at the blackboard. Chuck and I sat there and listened to them. And for a long period of time, they were going at it. At the end, it was a draw. Jackie couldn't convince them that we could do it, and they couldn't convince Jackie that we were going to kill Chuck.
The Air Force's 9th powered flight was scheduled for October 14, 1947. The program was close to reaching Mach 1.
I really hadn't coordinated too much with John Boyd, but I thought I better let him know. So I called Boyd on the phone. I appraised him of the situation as it stood. And the old son of a gun, he didn't say do it, he didn't say don't do it, he just said, well, good luck, that's it. Which I interpreted as a go ahead, so we did.
The goal was to advance our Mach number every flight, go faster. That particular day was to go, we didn't know we were going to get above Mach 1. Number one, we didn't know if we could or not. So we had gotten out to about 0.94 or 95 Mach number on the previous flight, and we said, well, maybe we can squeeze it out to about 9.6 or 9.7.
Early in the morning of October 14th, the X-1 was loaded aboard the B-29 and fueled. Electronic equipment for monitoring the flight was checked. By now, the extremely low temperature of the fuel in the X-1 would have cold-soaked the airplane. When Chuck Yeager climbed into the cockpit, it would be like entering an icebox. But today he had extra discomfort. Last evening, something happened that could threaten the success and safety of Flight Number 9. As Yeager maneuvered his way down toward the cockpit of the X-1, he was in pain. The pain intensified as he bent to go through the cockpit door. Late the previous evening, he'd gone horseback riding in the desert with his wife Glennis. It was getting dark.
We'd gone out this gate. We were coming back, and I was in the lead running, and somebody had closed the gate, and it's dark, and the first thing, when the time you see the gates closed, you're almost on it, and it kind of peeled the horse around. He, as I say, he couldn't pull more than about 3 Gs, but the horse hit the fence and flipped off, and it threw me through the air, and I had landed on my right side and busted a couple of ribs, and it hurt, yes.
I elected to go ahead with Chuck because there are certain people that are born, I hate to use the word lucky, because his skill gives him that luck. But nothing ever happened real bad to Chuck.
I talked to Jack Ridley. I said, Jack, I got a problem. I really hurt, and I don't know if I can get in the X-1 or not, because when you went down this ladder and had to hump over, bend double, slide in this door, it was really painful.
The X-1's cockpit door had to be secured from the inside using the pilot's right hand. Chuck Yeager's right side was too painful to do it. Jack Ridley had a solution.
And he said, well, I can fix that. And he got about a 10, 12-inch piece of broomstick, and I could use my left hand, stick this broomstick in the lever on the door, and raise it with my left hand and lock it. And that's we decided that's the way I'd do it.
Yeager eased his way into the cockpit. Jack Ridley placed the door in position, and using the broom handle, Yeager locked it from the inside. Yeager went through the pre-flight check procedures and waited for the B-29 to reach drop altitude.
Finally, up around above 20,000 feet or so, it was my job to get that airplane over a certain position and over the ground in space at a certain given altitude because the telemetering was going to pick up the drop. I had a problem in that if I went too fast, that B-29 used to start shaking and shuddering so much. I wasn't afraid of it, but I was afraid maybe that's what might have caused the bomb rack to lock up that one time.
At 45,000 feet, the X-1 was dropped.
Of course, the B-29 would jerk up because of the loss of weight sudden, like a bomb release, you might say. Seconds later, I could expect to see a P-80 buzz right up underneath my nose, straight up, and that was Bob Hoover, the chase pilot, because he took great delight in letting me know he was there.
I could control my acceleration rate by angle of climb. If I wanted to go rather slow, I could steepen it up and just barely accelerate, or drop the nose and pick up speed fast. And I was sitting there at about 955, 9.6 indicated, you know, just getting ready to say, and the Mach meter jumped off the scale. When it did, all the buffeting stopped because then it's supersonic flow over the whole airplane. And it came as a complete surprise. And the old nose started dropping on the airplane, so I rolled in a little leading edge down on the horizontal stabilizer to keep the nose up. And it's a piece of cake. Yeah. And we held it out there for about 20 seconds. And then I turned off the 3 chambers and decelerated back through, and I got the Mach meter jumped back to 9.6. And that's what happened. As the shock wave passed over the pitot head, then we got true Mach number indicated then, and we were made, it went supersonic. We made the sonic boom. The shock wave was formed on the airplane.
Chuck, of course, landed out on a dry lake bed. And when you consider what he did, you know, the phenomenal feat that he did, there were no bands to meet him, no media, no television, of course, nothing. He was just out. We had to send a Jeep out there to tow the plane in, and he rode back on the wing of the X-1. When I landed, not all of them, but some of the PhDs were there, and they didn't want to talk to me. They wanted to talk to Jackie Ridley. And one of them tossed one of his books in a waste barrel that was there. Said, Jackie, come on, we got to rewrite the book.
When we got the airplane above Mach 1, it surprised us, I think. But it really didn't impress us as much as it does now when you look back on it.
We went back to Wright Field. And Mr. Larry Bell, the owner of Bell Aircraft, he held a little party at the Dayton Biltmore Hotel in Dayton, Ohio. We had dinner, we had some drinks, and we celebrated quietly with Mr. Bell.
There was one major factor in the X-1's successful assault on the speed of sound.
The one thing, finding out that you needed a flying tail to operate in the region of speed of sound was really the big breakthrough in getting an airplane above the speed of sound. And it really paid off. The X-1 was classified. You know, the data that we were getting from the X-1, we didn't share it with the rest of the world. We kept it to ourselves. We fed it to the aircraft industry. And that one thing, finding out about the flying tail with the X-1, it gave us a quantum leap on the rest of the world in aerodynamics.
The Douglas D-5582 was part of the U.S. Navy's Transonic and Supersonic Research Program. The program began in 1945 and developed at the same time as the X-1. The D-5582's predecessor was a straight-wing jet-powered airplane that could fly close to the speed of sound after ground takeoff. The D-5582 had swept wings. It had rocket power, and it was designed to fly well in excess of Mach 1, also taking off from the ground. On January 5, 1949, the X-1 crew prepared for their own ground takeoff.
The X-1 couldn't get off the ground with a full load of fuel. The gear wasn't designed to take that weight. So we only put roughly 60% of the capacity of the fuel in it, liquid oxygen and water alcohol. And then we drug the airplane down on the lake bed. And
there was a degree of rivalry in the decision to make this flight. The Navy supporters of the D-5581 and 2 suggested that dropping an airplane from 45,000 feet to exceed the speed of sound was cheating. Such a view could not be allowed to go unchallenged. In the true spirit of the intense competition of test flying, the X-1 crew was showing that their airplane was capable of anything the Navy could do. But there were risks. The X-1's landing gear was subject to failure. The stresses of a ground takeoff, even with only 60% of the fuel capacity, would be great.
Fired off 2 chambers together and then 2 more together, and that airplane broke ground about 1,600 feet and flipped the gear and flaps up, and it was accelerating so fast that it busted the push-pull rod on the flaps and popped them right up. The airplane kind of sunk a little bit. I held it up. And then I just pulled the airplane up into an Immelmann, and 100 seconds was all the fuel that we had from ignition to burnout. And then at 100 seconds, I did an Immelmann, rolled out at 23,000 feet at supersonic speed, ran out of fuel, came down and landed. The whole flight lasted about 4 minutes.
After jettisoning its remaining fuel, Yeager brought the X-1 in for a smooth landing on the lake bed. This flight in January 1949 came to have long-term historical significance. It remains the only ground launch of a manned rocket-propelled aircraft with the X designation. But for Chuck Yeager and the X-1 crew, there was a double dose of satisfaction. Apart from the failure of the flaps, the flight had been a spectacular success. The X-1 had held together. But more than that, honor had been satisfied.
We did that because the Navy and Douglas was sort of bad-mouthing the X-1. There was a trick. And we did it the day before the D-558 Phase 2 flew. And boy, there were some long faces.